Chapter 30 of The Vanished Messenger by Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Fentolin pointed to the little pile of books upon the table, the deep easy chair, the green shaded lamps, the decanter of wine. He had insisted upon a visit, however brief, to the library. "It is a student's appeal which I make to you, Mr. Hamel," he said, with a whimsical smile. "Here we are in my study, with the door closed, secure against interruption, a bright fire in the grate, a blowing and ever-increasing wind outside. Let us go together over the ground of your last wonderful expedition over the Andes. You will find that I am not altogether ignorant of your profession, or of those very interesting geological problems with which you spoke of in connection with that marvelous railway scheme. We will discuss them side by side as sybarites, hang ourselves around with cigarette smoke, drink wine, and presently coffee. It is necessary, is it not, for many reasons, that we come better acquainted. You realize that, I am sure, and you will not persist in returning to your selfish solitude." Hamel's eyes were fixed a little longingly upon some of the volumes with which the table was covered. "You must not think me ungrateful or churlish, Mr. Fentolin," he begged. "I have a habit of keeping promises which I make to myself, and tonight I have made myself a promise that I will be back at the Tower by 10 o'clock. "You are obdurate?" Mr. Fentolin asked softly. "I am afraid I am." Mr. Fentolin busied himself with the handle of his chair. "Tell me," he insisted, "is there any other person save yourself to whom you have given this mysterious promise?" "No one," Hamel replied promptly. "I am a person very sensitive to atmosphere," Mr. Fentolin continued slowly. "Since the unfortunate visit of this man Dunster, I seem to have been conscious of a certain suspicion, a little cloud of suspicion under which I seem to live and move, even among the members of my own household. My sister-in-law is nervous and hysterical. Gerald has been sullen and disobedient. Esther has avoided me. And now, well, I find even your attitude a little difficult to understand. What does it mean, Mr. Hamel?" Hamel shook his head. "I am not in the confidence of the different members of your family," he answered. "So far as I personally am concerned—" "It pleases me sometimes," Mr. Fentolin interrupted, "to interfere to some extent in the affairs of the outside world. If I do so, that is my business. I do it for my own amusement. It is at no time a serious position which I take up. Have I by any chance, Mr. Hamel, become an object of suspicion to you?" "There are matters in which you are concerned," Hamel admitted, "which I do not understand, but I see no purpose in discussing them." Mr. Fentolin wheeled his chair round in a semicircle. He was now between the door and Hamel. "Weaker mortals than I, Mr. Hamel," he said calmly, "have wielded before now the powers of life and death. From my chair I can make the lightnings bite. Science has done away with the triumph of muscularity. Even as we are here together at this moment, Mr. Hamel, if we should disagree, it is I who am the preordained victor." Hamel saw the glitter in his hand. This was the end, then, of all doubt. He remained silent. "Suspicions, which are in a sense absurd," Mr. Fentolin continued, "have grown until I find them obtrusive and obnoxious. What have I to do with Mr. John P. Dunster? I sent him out from my house. If he is lost or ill, the affair is not mine. Yet one by one those around me are falling away. I told you an hour ago that Gerald was at Brancaster. It is a lie. He has left this house, but no soul in it knows his destination." Hamel started. "You mean that he has run away?" Mr. Fentolin nodded. "All that I can surmise is that he has followed Dunster," he proceeded. "He has an idea that in some way I robbed or injured the man. He has broken the bond of relationship between us. He has broken his solemn vow. He has run a grave and terrible risk." "What of Miss Esther?" Hamel asked quickly. "I have sent her away," Mr. Fentolin replied, "until we come to a clear understanding, you and I. You seem to be a harmless enough person, Mr. Hamel, but appearances are sometimes deceptive. It has been suggested to me that you are a spy." "By whom?" Hamel demanded. "By those in whom I trust," Mr. Fentolin told him sternly. "You are a friend of Reginald Kinsley. You met him in Norwich the other day, secretly. Kinsley's chief is a member of the Government. He is one of those who will find eternal obloquy if the Hague Conference comes to a successful termination. For some strange reason, I am supposed to have robbed or harmed the one man in the world whose message might bring to naught that conference. Are you here to watch me, Mr. Hamel? Are you one of those who believe that I am either in the pay of a foreign country, or that my harmless efforts to interest myself in great things are efforts inimical to this country? That I am, in short, a traitor?" "You must admit that many of your actions are incomprehensible," Hamel replied slowly. "There are things here which I do not understand, which certainly require explanation." "Still, why do you make them your business?" Mr. Fentolin persisted. "If indeed the course which I steer is a harmless one," he continued, with a strange new glitter in his eyes, "then you are an impertinent stranger to whom my door can no longer be open. If you have taken advantage of my hospitality to spy on me and my actions, if indeed you have a mission here, then you can carry it with you down into hell." "I understand that you are threatening me," Hamel murmured. Mr. Fentolin smiled. "Scarcely that, my young friend. I am not quite the obvious sort of a villain who flourishes revolvers and lures his victims into secret chambers. These words to you are simply words of warning. I am not like other men. Neither am I used to being crossed. When I am crossed, I am dangerous. Leave here, if you will, in safety, and mind your own affairs. But if you show one particle of curiosity as to mine, if you interfere in matters which concern me and me only, remember that you are encircled by powers which are entirely ruthless, absolutely omnipotent. You can walk back to the Tower tonight and remember that there isn't a step you take which might not be your last if I willed it, and never a soul the wiser. There's a very hungry little mother here who takes her victims and holds them tight. You can hear her calling to you now. Listen." He held up his finger. The tide had turned, and through the half-opened window came the low thunder of waves. "You decline to share my evening," Mr. Fentolin concluded. "Let it be so. Go on your way, Hamel. Only take care that your way does not cross mine." He backed his chair slowly and pressed the bell. Hamel felt himself dismissed. He passed out into the hall. The door of the drawing-room stood open. He heard the sound of Mrs. Fentolin's thin voice singing some little French song. He hesitated and then stepped in. With one hand she beckoned him to her, continuing to play all the time. He stepped over to her side. "I come to make my adieux," he whispered, with a glance towards the door. "You are leaving, then?" she asked quickly. He nodded. "Mr. Fentolin is in a strange humour," she went on a moment later, after she had struck the final chords of her song. "There are things going on around us which no one can understand. I think that one of his schemes has miscarried. He has gone too far. He suspects you. I cannot tell you why or how. If only you would go away." "What about Esther?" he asked quietly. "You must leave her," she cried, with a little catch in her throat. "Gerald has broken away. Esther and I must carry still the burden." She motioned him to go. He touched her fingers for a moment. "Mrs. Fentolin," he said, "I have been a good many years making up my mind. Now that I have done so, I do not think that anyone will keep Esther from me." She looked at him a little pitifully, a little wistfully. Then, with a shrug of the shoulders, she turned round to the piano and recommenced to play. Hamel took his coat and hat from a servant who was waiting in the hall and passed out into the night. He walked briskly until he reached the Tower. The wind had risen, but there was still enough light to help him on his way. The little building was in complete darkness. He opened the door and stepped into the sitting-room, lit the lamp, and holding it over his head, went down the passage and into the kitchen. Then he gave a start. The lamp nearly slipped from his fingers. Kneeling on the stone floor, in very much the same attitude as he had found her earlier in the day, Hannah Cox was crouching patiently by the door which led into the boathouse, her face expressionless, her ear turned towards the crack. She was listening. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Vanished Messenger by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Hamel set the lamp down upon the table. He glanced at the little clock upon the dresser. It was 10:15. The woman had observed his entrance, although it seemed in no way to have discomposed her. "Do you know the time, Mrs. Cox?" he asked. "You ought to have been home hours ago. What are you doing there?" She rose to her feet. Her expression was one of dogged but patient humility. "I started out for home before 9 o'clock, sir," she told him, "but it was worse than ever tonight. All the way along by the sea I seemed to hear their voices. So I came back. I came back to listen. I have been listening for an hour." He looked at her with a frown upon his forehead. "Mrs. Cox," he said, "I wish I could understand what it is that you have in your mind. Those are not real voices that you hear. You cannot believe that." "Not real voices?" she repeated, without the slightest expression in her tone. "Of course not. And tell me what connection you find between these fancies of yours and that room. Why do you come and listen here?" "I do not know," she answered patiently. "You must have some reason," he persisted. "I have no reason," she assured him. "Only some day I shall see behind these doors. Afterwards I shall hear the voices no more." She was busy tying a shawl around her head. Hamel watched her, still puzzled. He could not get rid of the idea that there was some method behind her madness. "Tell me, I have found you listening here before. Have you ever heard anything suspicious?" "I have heard nothing yet," she admitted. "Nothing that counts." "Come," he continued, "couldn't we clear this matter up sensibly? Do you believe that there is anybody in there? Do you believe the place is being used in a way for a wrong purpose? If so, we will insist upon having the keys from Mr. Fentolin. He cannot refuse. The place is mine." "Mr. Fentolin would not give you the keys, sir," she replied. "If he did, it would be useless." "Would you like me to break the door in?" Hamel asked. "You could not do it, sir," she told him. "Not you, nor anybody else. The door is thicker than my fist, of solid oak. It was a mechanic from New York who fitted the locks. I have heard it said in the village. Bill Hamas, the carpenter, declares that there are double doors. The workmen who were employed here were housed in a tent upon the beach and sent home the day they finished their job. They were never allowed in the village. They were foreigners, most of them, that came from nobody knows where, and when they had finished they disappeared. Why was that, sir? What is there inside which Mr. Fentolin needs to guard so carefully?" "Mr. Fentolin has invented something," Hamel explained. "He keeps the model in there. Inventors are very jealous of their work." She looked down upon the floor for a moment. "I shall be here at 7 o'clock in the morning, sir. I will give you your breakfast at the usual time." Hamel opened the door for her. "Good night, Mrs. Cox," he said. "Would you like me to walk a little way with you? It's a lonely path to the village, and the dikes are full." "Thank you, no, sir," she replied. "It's a lonely way, right enough, but it isn't loneliness that frightens me. I am less afraid out with the winds and the darkness than under this roof. If I lose my way and wander all night upon the marsh, I'll be safer out there than you, sir." She passed away, and Hamel watched her disappear into the darkness. Then he dragged out a bowl of tobacco and filled his pipe. Although he was half ashamed of himself, he strolled back once more into the kitchen, and drawing up a stool, he sat down just where he had discovered Hannah Cox, sat still and listened. No sound of any sort reached him. He sat there for 10 minutes. Then he scrambled to his feet. "She's mad, of course," he muttered. He mixed himself a whisky and soda, relit his pipe, which had gone out, and drew up an easy chair to the fire which she had left him in the sitting room. The wind had increased in violence, and the panes of his window rattled continually. He yawned and tried to fancy that he was sleepy. It was useless. He was compelled to admit the truth, that his nerves were all on edge. In a sense, he was afraid. The thought of bed repelled him. He had not a single impulse towards repose. Outside, the wind all the time was gathering force. More than once his windows were splashed with the spray carried on by the wind which followed the tide. He sat quite still and tried to think calmly, tried to piece together in his mind the sequence of events which had brought him to this part of the world, and which had led him to his remaining where he was, an undesired hanger-on at the threshold of Miles Fentolin. He had the feeling that tonight he had burned his boats. There was no longer any pretense of friendliness possible between him and this strange creature. Mr. Fentolin suspected him, realized that he himself was suspected. But of what? Hamel moved in his chair restlessly. Sometimes that gathering cloud of suspicion seemed to him grotesque. Of what real harm could he be capable? This little autocrat, who from his chair seemed to exercise such a malign influence upon everyone with whom he was brought into contact. Hamel sighed. The riddle was insoluble. With a sudden rush of warmer and more joyous feelings, he let the subject slip away from him. He closed his eyes and dreamed for a while. There was a new world before him, joys which only so short a time ago he had fancied had passed him by. He sat up in his chair with a start. The fire had become merely a handful of gray ashes. His limbs were numb and stiff. The lamp was flickering out. He had been dozing. How long he had no idea. Something had awakened him abruptly. There was a cold draught blowing through the room. He turned his head, his hand still gripping the sides of his chair. His heart gave a leap. The outer door was a few inches open, was being held open by some invisible force. There was someone there, someone on the point of entering stealthily. Even as he watched, the crack became a little wider. He sat with his eyes riveted upon that opening space. The unseen hand was still at work. Every instant he expected to see a face thrust forward. The sensation of absolute physical fear by which he was oppressed was a revelation to him. He found himself wishing almost feverishly that he was armed. The physical strength in which he had trusted seemed to him at that instant a valueless and impotent thing. There was a splash of spray or raindrops against the window and through the crack in the door. The lamp chimney hissed and sputtered, and finally the light went out. The room was in sudden darkness. Hamel sprang then to his feet. Silence had become an intolerable thing. He felt the close presence of another human being creeping in upon him. "Who's there?" he cried. "Who's there, I say?" There was no direct answer, only the door was pushed a little further open. He had stepped close to it now. The sweep of the wind was upon his face, although in the black darkness he could see nothing. And then a sudden recollection flashed in upon him. From his trousers pocket he snatched a little electric torch. In an instant his thumb had pressed the button. He turned it upon the door. The shivering white hand which held it open was plainly in view. It was the hand of a woman. He stepped swiftly forward. A dark figure almost fell into his arms. "Mrs. Fentolin!" he exclaimed, aghast. An hysterical cry, choked and subdued, broke from her lips. He half carried her, half led her to his easy chair. Suddenly steadied by the presence of this unlooked-for emergency, he closed the outside door and relit the lamp with firm fingers. Then he turned to face her, and his amazement at this strange visit became consternation. She was still in her dinner gown of black satin, but it was soaked through with the rain and hung about her like a black shroud. She had lost one of her shoes, and there was a great hole in her silk stocking. Her hair was all disarranged. One of its numerous switches was hanging down over her ear. The rouge upon her cheek had run down onto her neck. She sat there, looking at him out of her hollow eyes like some trapped animal. She was shaking with fear. It was fear, not faintness, which kept her silent. "Tell me, please, what is the matter?" he insisted, speaking as indifferently as he could. "Tell me at once what has happened." She pointed to the door. "Lock it," she implored. He turned down the latch and drew the bolt. That sound seemed to give her a little courage. Her fingers went to her throat for a moment. "Give me some water." He poured out some soda water. She drank only a sip and put it down again. He began to be alarmed. She had the appearance of one who has suddenly lost her senses. "Please tell me just what has happened," he begged. "If I can help in any way, you know I will. But you must tell me. Do you realize that it is 3 o'clock? I should have been in bed, only I went to sleep over the fire here." "I know," she answered. "It is just the wind that has taken away my breath. It was a hard struggle to get here. Listen. You are our friend, Mr. Hamel. Esther's and mine. Swear that you are our friend." "Upon my honor I am," he assured her. "You should know that." "For 8 years," she went on, her voice clear enough now, although it seemed charged with a curious metallic vibration. "For 8 years we've borne it, all three of us, slaves, bound hand and foot, lashed with his tongue, driven along the path of his desires. We have seen evil things. We have been on the point of rebellion, and he's come a little nearer, and he's pointed back. He has taken me by the hand, and I have walked by the side of his chair, loathing it, loathing myself, out onto the terrace and down below, just where it happened. You know what happened there, Mr. Hamel?" "You mean where Mr. Fentolin met with his accident?" "It was no accident," she cried, glancing for a moment around her. "It was no accident. It was my husband who took him up and threw him over the terrace, down below. My husband who tried to kill him. Esther's father, Gerald's father. Miles was in the Foreign Office then, and he did something disgraceful. He sold a secret to Austria. He was always a great gambler, and he was in debt. Seymour found out about it. He followed him down here. They met upon the terrace. I saw it." He was silent for a moment. "No one has known the truth," he murmured. "No one has ever known," she assented. "And our broken lives have been the price. It was Miles himself who made the bargain. We can't go on, Mr. Hamel." "I begin to understand," Hamel said softly. "You suffer everything from Miles Fentolin because he kept the secret. Very well. That belongs to the past. Something has happened, something tonight, which has brought you here. Tell me about it." Once more her voice began to shake. "We've seen terrible things, horrible things," she faltered. "We've held our peace. Perhaps it's been nearly as bad before, but we've closed our eyes. We haven't wanted to know. Now we can't help it, Mr. Hamel. Esther isn't at Lord Saxthorpe's. She never went there. They didn't ask her. And Dunster, the man Dunster—" "Where is Esther?" Hamel interrupted suddenly. "Locked up away from you, locked up because she rebelled." "And Dunster?" She shook her head. Her eyes were filled with horror. "But he left the Hall. I saw him." She shook her head. "It wasn't Dunster. It was the man Miles makes use of, Ryan, the librarian. He was once an actor." "Where's Dunster, then?" Hamel asked quickly. "What has become of him?" She opened her lips and closed them again, struggled to speak and failed. She sat there, breathing quickly but silent. The power of speech had gone. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Vanished Messenger by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Hamel, for the next few minutes, forgot everything else in his efforts to restore to consciousness his unexpected visitor. He rebuilt the fire, heated some water upon his spirit lamp, and forced some hot drink between the lips of the woman who was now almost in a state of collapse. Then he wrapped her round in his own ulster and drew her closer to the fire. He tried during those few moments to put away the memory of all that she had told him. Gradually she began to recover. She opened her eyes and drew a little sigh. She made no effort at speech, however. She simply lay and looked at him like some wounded animal. He came over to her side and chafed one of her cold hands. "Come," he said at last. "You begin to look more like yourself now. You are quite safe in here, and, for Esther's sake as well as your own, you know that I am your friend." She nodded, and her fingers gently pressed his. "I am sure of it," she murmured. "Now, let us see where we are," he continued. "Tell me exactly why you risk so much by leaving St. David's Hall tonight and coming down here. Isn't there any chance that he might find out?" "I don't know," she answered. "It was Lucy Price who sent me. She came to my room just as I was undressing." "Lucy Price?" he repeated. "The secretary?" "Yes. She told me that she had meant to come to you herself. She sent me instead. She thought it best. This man Dunster is being kept alive because there is something Miles wants him to tell him, and he won't. But tonight, if he is still alive, if he won't tell, they mean to make away with him. They are afraid." "Miss Price told you this?" Hamel asked gravely. Mrs. Fentolin nodded. "Yes, she said so. She knows everything. She has been like the rest of us. She, too, has suffered. She, too, has reached the breaking point. She loved him before the accident. She has been his slave ever since. Listen." She suddenly clutched his arm. They were both silent. There was nothing to be heard but the wind. She leaned a little closer to him. "Lucy Price sent me here tonight because she was afraid that it was tonight they meant to take him from his hiding place and kill him. The police have left off searching for Mr. Dunster in Yarmouth and at The Hague. There is a detective in the neighbourhood and another one on his way here. They are afraid to keep him alive any longer." "Where was Mr. Fentolin when you left?" Hamel asked. "I asked Lucy Price that," she replied. "When she came to my room, there were no signs of his leaving. She told me to come and tell you everything. Do you know where Mr. Dunster is?" Hamel shook his head. "Within a few yards of here," she went on. "He is in the boathouse, the place where Miles told you he kept the model of his invention. They brought him here the night before they put his clothes on Ryan and sent him off, disguised as Mr. Dunster, in the car to Yarmouth." Hamel started up, but she clutched at his arm and pulled him back. "No," she cried, "you can't break in. There are double doors and a wonderful lock. The boathouse is yours. The building is yours. In the morning you must demand the keys, if he does not come tonight." "And how are we to know," Hamel asked, "if he comes tonight?" "Go outside," she whispered. "Look towards St. David's Hall and tell me how many lights you can see." He drew back the bolt, unlatched the door, and stepped out into the darkness. The wind and the driving rain beat against his face. A cloud of spray enveloped and soaked him. Like lamps hung in the sky, the lights of St. David's Hall shone out through the black gulf. He counted them carefully, then he stepped back. "There are 7, he told her, closing the door with an effort. She counted upon her fingers. "I must come and see," she muttered. "I must be sure. Help me." He lifted her to her feet, and they staggered out together. "Look," she went on, gripping his arm. "You see that row of lights? If anything happens, if Mr. Fentolin leaves the hall tonight to come down here, a light will appear on the left in the far corner. We must watch for that light. We must watch." The words, whispered hoarsely into his ear, suddenly died away. Even as they stood there, far away from the other lights, another one shone suddenly out in the spot towards which she had pointed and continued to burn steadily. He felt the woman who was clinging to his arm become suddenly a dead weight. "She was right," Mrs. Fentolin moaned. "He is coming down tonight. He is preparing to leave now. Perhaps he has already started. What shall we do? What shall we do?" Hamel was conscious of a gathering sense of excitement. He, too, looked at the signal which was flashing out its message towards them. Then he gripped his companion's arm and almost carried her back into the sitting-room. "Look here," he said firmly. "You can do nothing further. You have done your part and done it well. Stay where you are and wait. The rest belongs to me." "But what can you do?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fear. "Meekins will come with him, and Dr. Sarson, unless he is already here. What can you do against them? Meekins can break any ordinary man's back, and Mr. Fentolin will have a revolver." Hamel threw another log onto the fire and drew her chair closer to it. "Never mind about," he declared cheerfully. "Mr. Fentolin is too clever to attempt violence, except as a last resort. He knows that I have friends in London who would need some explanation of my disappearance. Stay here and wait." She recognized a note of authority in his voice, and she bowed her head. Then she looked up at him. She was a changed woman. "Perhaps I have done ill to drag you into our troubles, Mr. Hamel," she said, "and yet I believe in you. I believe that you really care for Esther. If you can help us now, it will be for your happiness, too. You are a man. God bless you." Hamel groped his way round the side of the tower and took up a position at the extreme corner of the landward side of the building, within a yard of the closed doors. The light far out upon the left was still gleaming brightly, but two of the others in a line with it had disappeared. He flattened himself against the wall and waited, listened intently, his eyes straining through the darkness. Yet they were almost upon him before he had the slightest indication of their presence. A single gleam of light in the path, come and gone like a flash, the gleam of an electric torch directed momentarily towards the road, was his first indication that they were near. A moment or two later he heard the strange click, click of the little engine attached to Mr. Fentolin's chair. Hamel set his teeth and stepped a few inches further back. The darkness was so intense that they were actually within a yard or so of him before he could even dimly discern their shapes. There were three of them, Mr. Fentolin in his chair, Dr. Sarson and Meekins. They paused for a moment while the latter produced a key. Hamel distinctly heard a slow, soft whisper from Dr. Sarson. "Shall I go round to the front and see that he is in bed?" "No need," Mr. Fentolin replied calmly. "It is nearly 4 o'clock. Better not to risk the sound of your footsteps upon the pebbles. Now." The door swung noiselessly open. The darkness was so complete that even though Hamel could have touched them with an outstretched hand, their shapes were invisible. Hamel, who had formed no definite plans, had no time to hesitate. As the last one disappeared through the door, he too slipped in. He turned abruptly to the left and, holding his breath, stood against the wall. The door closed behind them. The gleam of the electric light flashed across the stone floor and rested for a moment upon a trap door which Meekins had already stooped to lift. It fell back noiselessly upon rubber studs, and Meekins immediately slipped through it a ladder, on either side of which was a grooved stretch of board, evidently fashioned to allow Mr. Fentolin's carriage to pass down. Hamel held his breath. The moment for him was critical. If the light flashed once in his direction, he must be discovered. Both Meekins and Dr. Sarson, however, were intent upon the task of steering Mr. Fentolin's little carriage down below. They placed the wheels in the two grooves, and Meekins secured the carriage with a rope, which he let run through his fingers. As soon as the little vehicle had apparently reached the bottom, he turned, thrust the electric torch in his pocket, and stepped lightly down the ladder. Dr. Sarson followed his example. They disappeared in perfect silence and left the door open. Presently a gleam of light came travelling up, from which Hamel knew that they had lit a lamp below. Very softly he crept across the floor, threw himself upon his stomach and peered down. Below him was a room, or rather a cellar, parts of which seemed to have been cut out of the solid rock. Immediately underneath was a plain iron bedstead, on which was lying the stretched figure of a man. In those first few moments Hamel failed altogether to recognize Mr. Dunster. He was thin and white, and he seemed to have shrunken. His face, with its coarse growth of beard, seemed like the face of an old man. Yet his eyes were open, eyes dull and heavy as though with pain. So far no word had been spoken, but at that moment Mr. Fentolin broke the silence. "My dear guest," he said, "I bring you our most sincere apologies. It has gone very much against the grain, I can assure you, to have neglected you for so long a time. It is entirely the fault of the very troublesome young man who occupies the other portion of this building. In the daytime his presence makes it exceedingly difficult for us to offer you those little attentions to which you might naturally expect." The man upon the bed neither moved nor changed his position in any way, nor did he speak. All power of initiative seemed to have deserted him. He lay quite still, his eyes fixed upon Mr. Fentolin. "There comes a time," the latter continued, "when every one of us is confronted with what might be described as the crisis of our lives. Yours has come, my guest, at precisely this moment. It is, if my watch tells me the truth, 25 to 4. It is the last day of April. The year you know. You have exactly 1 minute to decide whether you will live a short time longer or whether you will die on this last day of April and before, say, 4:15. Make that little journey the nature of which you and I have discussed more than once." Still the man upon the bed made no movement nor any reply. Mr. Fentolin sighed and beckoned to Dr. Sarson. "I'm afraid," he whispered, that wonderful drug of yours, Doctor, has been even a little too far-reaching in its results. It has kept our friend so quiet that he has lost even the power of speech, perhaps even the desire to speak. A little restorative, I think, just a few drops." Dr. Sarson nodded silently. He drew from his pocket a little phial and poured into a wineglass which stood on a table by the side of the bed half a dozen drops of some ruby-colored liquid, to which he added a tablespoonful of water. Then he leaned once more over the bed and poured the contents of the glass between the lips of the semi-conscious man. "Give him 2 minutes," he said calmly. "He will be able to speak then." Mr. Fentolin nodded and leaned back in his chair. He glanced around the room a little critically. There was a thick carpet upon the floor, a sofa piled with cushions in one corner, and several other articles of furniture. The walls, however, were uncovered and were stained with damp. A great pink fungus stood out within a few inches of the bed, a grim mixture of exquisite coloring and loathsome imperfections. The atmosphere was fetid. Meekins suddenly struck a match and lit some grains of powder in a saucer. A curious odor of incense stole through the place. Mr. Fentolin nodded appreciatively. "That is better," he declared. "Really, the atmosphere here is positively unpleasant. I am ashamed to think that our guest has had to put up with it so long. And yet," he went on, "I think we must call it his own fault. I trust that he will no longer be obstinate." The effect of the restorative began to show itself. The man on the bed moved restlessly. His eyes were no longer altogether expressionless. He was staring at Mr. Fentolin as one looks at some horrible vision. Mr. Fentolin smiled pleasantly. "Now you are looking more like your old self, my dear Mr. Dunster," he remarked. "I don't think I need to repeat what I said when I first came, need I? You have just to utter that one word, and your little visit to us will be at an end." The man looked around at all of them. He raised himself a little on his elbow. For the first time Hamel, crouching above, recognized any likeness to Mr. John P. Dunster. "I'll see you in hell first." Mr. Fentolin's face momentarily darkened. He moved a little nearer to the man upon the bed. "Dunster," he said, "I am in grim earnest. Never mind arguments. Never mind why I am on the other side. They are restless about you in America. Unless I can cable that word tomorrow morning, they'll communicate direct with The Hague, and I shall have had my trouble for nothing. It is not my custom to put up with failure. Therefore, let me tell you that no single one of my threats has been exaggerated. My patience has reached the breaking point. Give me that word, or before 4 o'clock strikes you will find yourself in a new chamber, among the corpses of those misguided fishermen, mariners of ancient days, and a few others. It's only a matter of 50 yards out to the great sea pit below the Dagger Rocks. I have spoken to you about it before, haven't I? So surely as I speak to you of it at this moment." Mr. Fentolin's speech came to an abrupt termination. A convulsive movement of Meekins, an expression of blank amazement on the part of Dr. Sarson, had suddenly checked the words upon his lips. He turned his head quickly in the direction towards which they had been gazing, towards which, in fact, at that moment, Meekins, with a low cry, had made a fruitless spring. The ladder down which they had descended was slowly disappearing. Meekins, with a jump, missed the last rung by only a few inches. Some unseen hand was drawing it up. Already the last few feet were vanishing in mid-air. Mr. Fentolin sat quite quiet and still. He looked through the trap door and saw Hamel. "Most ingenious, and, I must confess, most successful, my young friend," he exclaimed pleasantly. "When you have made the ladder quite secure, perhaps you will be so good as to discuss this little matter with us." There was no immediate reply. The eyes of all 4 men were turned now upon that empty space through which the ladder had finally disappeared. Mr. Fentolin's fingers disappeared within the pocket of his coat. Something very bright and glistening in his hand when he withdrew it. "Come and parley with us, Mr. Hamel," he begged. "You will not find us unreasonable." Hamel's voice came back in reply, but Hamel himself kept well away from the opening. "The conditions," he said, "are unpropitious. A little time for reflection will do you no harm." The trap door was suddenly closed. Mr. Fentolin's face, as he looked up, became diabolic. "We are trapped," he muttered, "caught like rats in a hole." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Vanished Messenger by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A gleam of day was in the sky as Hamel, with Mrs. Fentolin by his side, passed along the path which led from the tower to St. David's Hall. Lights were still burning in its windows. The outline of the building itself was faintly defined against the sky. Behind him, across the sea, was that one straight line of gray merging into silver. The rain had ceased, and the wind had dropped. On either side of them stretched the brimming creeks. "Can we get into the house without waking anyone?" he asked. "Quite easily," she assured him. "The front door is never barred." She walked by his side swiftly and with surprising vigor. In the still gray light, her face was more ghastly than ever, but there was a new firmness about her mouth, a new decision in her tone. They reached the hall without further speech, and she led the way to a small door on the eastern side, through which they entered noiselessly and passed along a little passage out into the hallway. A couple of lights were still burning. The place seemed full of shadows. "What are you going to do now?" she whispered. "I want to ring up London on the telephone," he replied. "I know that there is a detective either in the neighborhood or on his way here, but I shall tell my friend that he had better come down himself." She nodded. "I am going to release Esther," she said. "She is locked in her room. The telephone is in the study. I will come down there to you." She passed silently up the broad staircase. Hamel groped his way across the hall into the library. He turned on the small electric reading lamp and drew up a chair to the side of the telephone. Even as he lifted the receiver to his ear, he looked around him half apprehensively. It seemed as though every moment he would hear the click of Mr. Fentolin's chair. He got the exchange at Norwich without difficulty, and a few minutes later a sleepy reply came from the number he had rung up in London. It was Kinsley's servant who answered. "I want to speak to Mr. Kinsley at once, upon utmost important business," Hamel announced. "Very sorry, sir," the man replied. "Mr. Kinsley left town last night for the country." "Where has he gone?" Hamel demanded quickly. "You can tell me. You know who I am. I'm Mr. Hamel." "Into Norfolk somewhere, sir. He went with several other gentlemen." "Is that Bullen?" Hamel asked. The man admitted the fact. "Can you tell me if any of the people with whom Mr. Kinsley left London were connected with the police?" he inquired. The man hesitated. "I believe so, sir," he admitted. "The gentlemen started in a motor car and were going to drive all night." Hamel laid down the receiver. At any rate, he would not be left long with this responsibility upon him. He walked out into the hall. The house was wrapped in deep silence. Then, from somewhere above him, coming down the stairs, he heard the rustle of a woman's gown. He looked up and saw Miss Price, fully dressed, coming slowly towards him. She held up her finger and led the way back into the library. She was dressed as neatly as ever, but there was a queer light in her eyes. "I have seen Mrs. Seymour Fentolin," she said. "She tells me that you have left Mr. Fentolin and the others in the subterranean room of the tower." Hamel nodded. "They have Dunster down there," he told her. "I followed them in. It seemed the best thing to do. I have a friend in London who is on his way down here now with some detective officers to inquire into the matter of Dunster's disappearance." "Are you going to leave them where they are until these people arrive?" she asked. "I think so," he replied, after a moment's hesitation. "I don't seem to have had time to consider even what to do. The opportunity came, and I embraced it. There they are, and they won't dare do any further harm to Dunster now. Mrs. Fentolin was down in my room, and I thought it best to bring her back first before I even parleyed with them again." "You must be careful," she advised slowly. "The man Dunster has been drugged. He has lost some of his will. he may have lost some of his mental balance. Mr. Fentolin is clever. He will find a dozen ways to wriggle out of any charge that can be brought against him. You know what he has really done?" "I can guess." "He has kept back a document signed by the 12 men in America who control the whole of Wall Street, who control practically the money markets of the world. The document is a warning to Germany that they will have no war against England. Owing to Mr. Fentolin, it has not been delivered, and the conference is sitting now. War may be declared at any moment." "But as a matter of common sense," Hamel asked, "why does Mr. Fentolin desire war?" "You do not understand Mr. Fentolin," she told him quietly. "He is not like other men. There are some who live almost entirely for the sake of making others happy, who find joy in seeing people content and satisfied. Mr. Fentolin is the reverse of this. He has but one craving in life, to see pain in others. To see a human being suffer is to him a debauch of happiness. A war which laid this country waste would fill him with delight, which you could never understand. There are no normal human beings like this. It is a disease in the man, a disease which came upon him after his accident." "Yet you have all been his slaves," Hamel said curiously. "We have all been his slaves," she admitted, "for different reasons. Before his accident came, Mr. Fentolin was my master, and the only man in the world for me. After his accident, I think my feelings for him, if anything, grew stronger. I became his slave. I sold my conscience, my self-respect, everything in life worth having, to bring a smile to his lips, to help him through a single moment of his misery. And just lately, the reaction has come. He has played with me just as he would sit and pull the legs out of a spider to watch its agony. I have been one of his favorite amusements. And even now, if he came into this room, I think that I should be helpless. I should probably fall at his feet and pray for forgiveness." Hamel looked at her wonderingly. "I have come down to warn you," she went on. "It is possible that this is the beginning of the end, that his wonderful fortune will desert him, that his star has gone down. But remember that he has the brains and courage of a genius. You think that you have him in a trap. Don't be surprised, when you go back, to find that he has turned the tables upon you." "Impossible," Hamel declared. "I looked all around the place. There isn't a window or opening anywhere. The trap door is in the middle of the ceiling, and it is 15 feet from the floor. It shuts with a spring." "It may be as you say," she observed. "It may be that he is safe. Remember, though, if you go near him, that he is desperate." "Do you know where Miss Fentolin is?" he interrupted. "She is with her mother," the woman replied impatiently. "She is coming down. Tell me, what are you going to do with Mr. Fentolin? Nothing else matters." "I have a friend," Hamel answered, "who will see to that." "If you are relying upon the law," she said, "I think you will find that the law cannot touch him. Mr. Dunster was brought to the house in a perfectly natural manner. He was certainly injured, and injured in a railway accident. Dr. Sarson is a fully qualified surgeon, and he will declare that Mr. Dunster was unfit to travel. If necessary, they will have destroyed the man's intelligence. If you think that you have broken him, let me warn you that you may be disappointed. Let me, if I may, give you one word of advice." "Please do," Hamel begged. She looked at him coldly. Her tone was still free from any sort of emotion. "You have taken up some sort of position here," she continued, "as a friend of Mrs. Seymour Fentolin, a friend to the family. Don't let them come back under the yoke. You know the secret of their bondage." "I know it," he admitted. "They have been his slaves because their absolute obedience to his will was one of the conditions of his secrecy. He has drawn the cords too tight. Better let the truth be known, if needs be, than to have their 3 lives broken. Don't let them go back under his governance. For me, I cannot tell. If he comes back, as he will come back, I may be a slave again. But let them break away. Listen, that is Mrs. Fentolin." She left him. Hamel followed her out into the hall. Esther and her mother were already at the foot of the stairs. He drew them into the study. Esther gave him her hands, but she was trembling in every limb. "I am terrified," she whispered. "Every moment I think I can hear the click of that awful carriage. He will come back. I am sure he will come back." "He may," Hamel answered sturdily, "but never to make you people his slaves again. You have done enough. You have earned your freedom." "I agree," Mrs. Fentolin said firmly. "We have gone on from sacrifice to sacrifice, until it has become a habit with us to consider him the master of our bodies and our souls. Today, Esther, we have reached the breaking point. Not even for the sake of that message from the other side of the grave, not even to preserve his honor and his memory, can we do more." Hamel held up his finger. He opened the French windows, and they followed him out onto the terrace. The gray dawn had broken now over the sea. There were gleams of fitful sunshine on the marshes. Some distance away, a large motor car was coming rapidly along the road. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Vanished Messenger by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. John P. Dunster, lying flat upon his little bed, watched with dilated eyes the disappearance of the latter. Then he laughed. It was a queer sound, broken, spasmodic, devoid of any of the ordinary elements of humor, and yet it was a laugh. Mr. Fentolin turned his head towards his prisoner and nodded thoughtfully. "What a constitution, my friend!" he exclaimed, without any trace of disturbance in his voice. "And what a sense of humor! Strange that a trifling circumstance like this should affect it. Meekins, burn some more of the powder. The atmosphere down here may be salubrious, but I am unaccustomed to it." "Perhaps," Mr. Dunster said in a hollow tone, "you will have some opportunity now of discovering with me what it is like." "That, too, is just possible," Mr. Fentolin admitted, blowing out a little volume of smoke from a cigarette which he had just lit. "But one never knows. We have friends, and our position, although I must admit a little ridiculous, is easily remedied. But how that mischief-making Mr. Hamel could have found his way into the boat house does, I must confess, perplex me." "He must have been hanging around and followed us in when we came," Meekins muttered. "Somehow I fancied I felt someone near." "Our young friend," Mr. Fentolin continued, "has, without a doubt, an obvious turn of mind. He will send for his acquaintance in the Foreign Office. They will haul out Mr. Dunster here, and he will have a belated opportunity of delivering his message at The Hague." "You aren't going to murder me first, then?" Mr. Dunster grunted. Mr. Fentolin smiled at him benignly. "My dear and valued guest," he protested, "why so forbidding an idea? Let me assure you from the bottom of my heart that any bodily harm to you is the most unlikely thing in the world. You see, though you might not think it," he went on, "I love life. That is why I keep a doctor always by my side. That is why I insist upon his making a complete study of my constitution and treating me in every respect as though I were indeed an invalid. I am really only 59 years old. It is my intention to live until I am 89. An offense against the law of the nature which you indicate might interfere materially with my intentions." Mr. Dunster struggled for a moment for breath. "Look here," he said, "that's all right, but do you suppose you won't be punished for what you've done to me? You've laid a deliberate plot to bring me to St. David's Hall. You've kept me locked up, dosed me with drugs, brought me down here at the dead of night, kept me a prisoner in a dungeon. Do you think you can do that for nothing? Do you think you won't have to suffer for it?" Mr. Fentolin smiled. "My dear Mr. Dunster," he reminded him, "you were in a railway accident, you know. There is no possible doubt about that. And that wound in your head is still there, in a very dangerous place. Men who have been in railway accidents, and who have a gaping wound very close to the brain, are subject to delusions. I have simply done my best to play the Good Samaritan. Your clothes and papers are all untouched. If my eminent physician had pronounced you ready to travel a week ago, you would have certainly been allowed to depart a week ago. Any interference in your movements has been entirely in the interest of your health." Mr. Dunster tried to sit up, but found himself unable. "So you think they won't believe my story, huh?" he muttered. "Well, we shall see." Mr. Fentolin thoughtfully contemplated the burning end of his cigarette for a moment. "If I believed," he said, that there was any chance of your statements being accepted, I'm afraid I should be compelled, in all our interests, to ask Dr. Sarson to pursue just a step further the experiment into the anatomy of your brain with which he has already trifled." Mr. Dunster's face was suddenly ghastly. His reserve of strength seemed to ebb away. The memory of some horrible moment seemed to hold him in its clutches. "For God's sake, leave me alone," he moaned. "Let me get away. That's all. Let me crawl away." "Ah," Mr. Fentolin murmured, "that sounds much more reasonable. When you talk like that, my friend, I feel indeed that there is hope for you. Let us abandon this subject for the present. Have you solved the puzzle yet?" he asked Meekins. Meekins was standing below the closed trap door. He had already dragged up a wooden case underneath and was piling it with various articles of furniture. "Not yet, sir," he replied. "When I have made this steadier, I am just going to see what pressure I can bring to bear on the trap door." "I heard the bolts go," Dr. Sarson remarked uneasily. "In that case," Mr. Fentolin declared, "it will indeed be an interesting test of our friend Meekins' boasted strength. Meekins holds his place, a very desirable place, too, chiefly for two reasons. First, his discretion, and secondly, his muscles. He has never before had a real opportunity of testing the latter. We shall see." Dr. Sarson came slowly and gravely to the bedside. He looked down upon his patient. Mr. Dunster shivered. "I am not sure, sir," he said very softly, "that Mr. Dunster, in his present state of mind, is a very safe person to be allowed his freedom. It is true that we have kept him here for his own sake, because of his fits of mental wandering. Our statements, however, may be doubted. An apparent return to sanity on his part may lend colour to his accusations, especially if permanent. Perhaps it would be as well to pursue that investigation a shade further, a touch more to the left, and I do not think that Mr. Dunster will remember much in this world likely to affect us." Mr. Dunster's face was like marble. There were beads of perspiration upon his forehead. His eyes were filled with reminiscent horror. Mr. Fentolin bent over him with genuine interest. "What a picture he would make," he murmured. "What a drama! Do you know, I am half inclined to agree with you, Sarson. The only trouble is that you have not your instruments here." "I could improvise something that would do the trick," the doctor said thoughtfully. "It really isn't a complicated affair. It seems to me that his story may gain credence from the very fact of our being discovered in this extraordinary place. To have moved him here was a mistake, sir." "Perhaps so," Mr. Fentolin admitted with a sigh. "It was our young friend, Mr. Hamel, who was responsible for it. I fancied him arriving with a search warrant at any moment. We will bear in mind your suggestion for a few minutes. Let us watch Meekins. This promises to be interesting." By dint of piling together all the furniture in the place, the man was now able to reach the trap door. He pressed upon it vigorously, without even bending the wood. Mr. Fentolin smiled pleasantly. "Meekins," he said, "look at me." The man turned and faced his master. His aspect of dogged civility had never been more apparent. "Now listen," Mr. Fentolin went on. "I want to remind you of certain things, Meekins. We are among friends here. No secrecy, you understand, or anything of that sort. You need not be afraid. You know how you came to me. You remember that little affair of Anna Jay's in Hartlepool?" The face of the man was filled with terror. He began to tremble where he stood. Mr. Fentolin played for a moment with his collar, as though he found it tight. "Such a chance it was, my dear Meekins," Mr. Fentolin continued cheerfully, "which brought me that little scrap of knowledge concerning you. It has brought me through all these years a good deal of faithful service. I am not ungrateful, believe me. I intend to retain you for my body servant and to keep my lips sealed for a great many years to come. Now remember what I have said. When we leave this place, that little episode will steal back into a far corner of my mind. I shall, in short, forget it. If we are caught here and inconvenience follows, well, I cannot say. Do your best, Meekins. Do a little better than your best. You have the reputation of being a strong man. Let us see you justify it." The man took a long breath and returned to his task. His shoulders and arms were upon the door. He began to strain. He grew red in the face. The veins across his forehead stood out, blue like tightly drawn strings. his complexion became purple. Through his open mouth his breath came in short pants. With every muscle of his body and neck he strained and strained. The woodwork gave a little, but it never even cracked. With a sob, he suddenly almost collapsed. Mr. Fentolin looked at him, frowning. Very good, Meekins," he said, "but not quite good enough. You are a trifle out of practice, perhaps. Take your breath. Take time. Remember that you have another chance. I am not angry with you, Meekins. I know there are many enterprises upon which one does not succeed the first time. Get your breath. There is no hurry. Next time you try, see that you succeed. It is very important, Meekins, for you as well as for us, that you succeed." The man turned doggedly back to his task. The eyes of the three men watched him. Mr. Dunster on the bed, Dr. Sarson, pale and gloomy, with something of fear in his dark eyes, and Mr. Fentolin himself, whose expression seemed to be one of purely benevolent and encouraging interest. Once more the face of the man became almost unrecognizable. There was a great crack. The trap door had shifted. Meekins, with a little cry, reeled and sank backwards. Mr. Fentolin clapped his hands lightly. "Really, Meekins," he declared, "I do not know when I have enjoyed any performance so much. I feel as if I were back in the days of the Roman gladiators. I can see you mean to succeed. You will succeed. You do not mean to end your days amid objectionable surroundings." With the air of a man temporarily mad, Meekins went back to his task. He was sobbing to himself now. His clothes had burst away from him. Suddenly there was a crash. The hinges of the trap door had parted. With the blood streaming from a wound in his forehead, Meekins staggered back to his feet. Mr. Fentolin nodded. "Excellent," he pronounced. "Really excellent. With a little assistance from our friend Meekins, you, I am sure, Dr. Sarson, will now be able to climb up and let down the steps." Dr. Sarson stood by Mr. Fentolin's chair, and together they looked up through the fragments of the trap door. Meekins was still breathing heavily. Suddenly they heard the sound of a sharp report as of a door above being slammed. "Someone was in the boathouse when I broke the trap door," Meekins muttered. "I heard them moving about." Mr. Fentolin frowned. "Then let us hurry," he said. "Sarson, what about your patient?" Mr. Dunster was lying upon his side, watching them. The doctor went over to the bedside and felt his pulse and head. "He will do for 12 hours," he pronounced. "If you think that other little operation—" He broke off and looked at Mr. Fentolin meaningly. The man on the bed shrank back, his eyes lit with horror. Mr. Fentolin smiled pleasantly. "I fear," he said, "that we must not stay for that just now. A little later on, perhaps, if it becomes necessary. Let us first attend to the business on hand." Meekins once more clambered on to the little heap of furniture. The doctor stood by his side for a moment. Then, with an effort, he was hoisted up until he could catch hold of the floor of the outhouse. Meekins gave one push and he disappeared. "Anyone up there?" Mr. Fentolin inquired, a shade of anxiety in his tone. "No one," the doctor reported. "Has anything been disturbed?" Dr. Sarson was some little time before he replied. "Yes," he said. "Someone seems to have been rummaging about." "Send down the steps quickly," Mr. Fentolin ordered. "I'm beginning to find the atmosphere here unpleasant." There was a brief silence. Then they heard the sound of the ladder being dragged across the floor, and a moment or two later it was carefully lowered and placed in position. Mr. Fentolin passed a rope through the front of his carriage and was drawn up. From his bed, Mr. Dunster watched them go. It was hard to tell whether he was relieved or disappointed. "Who's been in here?" Mr. Fentolin demanded, as he looked around the place. There was no reply. A gray twilight was struggling now through the high dust-covered windows. Meekins, who had gone on towards the door, suddenly called out, "Someone has taken away the key. The door is locked on the other side." Mr. Fentolin's frown was malign, even for him. "Our dear friend Mr. Hamel, I suppose," he muttered. "Another little debt we shall owe him. Try the other door." Meekins moved toward the partition. Suddenly he paused. Mr. Fentolin's hand was outstretched. He, too, was listening. Above the low thunder of the sea came another sound, a sound which at that moment they none of them probably understood. There was a steady crashing of feet upon the pebbles, a low murmur of voices. Mr. Fentolin, for the first time, showed symptoms of fear. "Try the other door quickly," he directed. Meekins came back, shaking his head. Outside, the noise seemed to be increasing. The door was suddenly thrown open. Hannah Cox stood outside in her plain black dress, her hair wind-tossed, her eyes aflame. She held the key in her fingers, and she looked in upon them. Her lips seemed to move, but she said nothing. "My good woman," Mr. Fentolin exclaimed, frowning, "are you the person who removed that key?" She laid her hand upon his chair. She took no notice of the other two. "Come," she said. "There is something here I want you to listen to. Come." End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Vanished Messenger by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Fentolin arrived outside on the stone front of the boathouse, pointed the wheels of his chair toward the hall. Hannah Cox, who kept by his side, however, drew it gently towards the beach. "Down here," she directed softly. "Bring your chair down the plankway, close to the water's edge." "My good woman," Mr. Fentolin exclaimed furiously, "I am not in the humor for this sort of thing. Lock up Sarson at once. I am in a hurry to get back." "But you will come just this little way," she continued, speaking without any change of tone. "You see, the others are waiting too. I have been down to the village and fetched them up." Mr. Fentolin followed her outstretched finger and gave a sudden start. Standing at the edge of the sea were a dozen or 20 fishermen. They were all muttering together and looking at the top of the boathouse. As he realized the direction of their gaze, Mr. Fentolin's face underwent a strange transformation. He seemed to shrink in his chair. He was ghastly pale, even to the lips. Slowly he turned his head. From a place in the roof of the boathouse a tall support had appeared. On the top was a swinging globe. "What have you to do with that?" he asked in a low tone. "I found it," she answered. "I felt that it was there. I have brought them up with me to see it. I think that they would want to ask you some questions. But first, come and listen." Mr. Fentolin shook her off. He looked around for Meekins. "Meekins, stand by my chair," he ordered sharply. "Turn around. I wish to go to the hall. Drive this woman away." Meekins came hurrying up, but almost at the same moment half a dozen of the brown-jerseyed fishermen detached themselves from the others. They formed a little bodyguard around the bath chair. "What is the meaning of this?" Mr. Fentolin demanded, his voice shrill with anger. "Didn't you hear what I said? This woman annoys me. Send her away." None of the fishermen answered a word or made the slightest movement to obey him. One of them, a gray-bearded veteran, drew the chair a little further down the planked way across the pebbles. Hannah Cox kept close to its side. They came to a standstill only a few yards from where the waves were breaking. She lifted her hand. "Listen!" she cried. "Listen!" Mr. Fentolin turned helplessly around. The little group of fishermen had closed in upon Sarson and Meekins. The woman's hand was upon his shoulder. She pointed seaward to where a hissing line of white foam marked the spot where the topmost of the rocks were visible. "You wonder why I have spent so much of my time out here," she said quietly. "Now you will know. If you will listen as I am listening, as I have listened for so many weary hours, so many weary years, you will hear them calling to me, David and John and Stephen. The light! Do you hear what they are crying? The light! Fentolin's light! Look!" She forced him to look once more at the top of the boathouse. "They were right," she proclaimed, her voice gaining in strength and intensity. "They were neither drunk nor reckless. They steered as straight as human hand could guide a tiller, for Fentolin's light. And there they are, calling and calling at the bottom of the sea. My 3 boys and my man. Do you know for whom they call?" Mr. Fentolin shrank back in his chair. "Take this woman away," he ordered the fishermen. "Do you hear? Take her away. She's mad." They looked towards him, but not one of them moved. Mr. Fentolin raised his whistle to his lips and blew it. "Meekins!" he cried. "Where are you? Meekins!" He turned his head and saw at once that Meekins was powerless. 5 or 6 of the fishermen had gathered around him. There were at least 30 of them about, sinewy, powerful men. The only person who moved towards Mr. Fentolin's carriage was Jacob, the coast guardsman. "Mr. Fentolin, sir," he said, "the lads have got you bully safe. It's a year and more that Hannah Cox has been about the village with some story about 2 lights on a stormy night. It's true when she says that her man and boys lie drowned. There is William Green besides, and a nephew of my own, John Callender, and Philip Green. He was saved. He swore by all that was holy that he steered straight for the light when his boat struck, and that as he swam for shore 5 minutes later, he saw the light reappear in another place. It's a strange story. What have you to say, sir, about that?" He pointed straight to the wire-encircled globe which towered on its slender support above the boathouse. Mr. Fentolin looked at it and looked back at the coast guardsman. The brain of a Machiavelli could scarcely have invented a plausible reply. "The light was never lit there," he said. "It was simply to help me in some electrical experiments." Then, for the first time in their lives, those who were looking on saw Mr. Fentolin apart from his carriage. Without any haste, but with amazing strength, Hannah Cox leaned over and with her arms around his middle, lifted him sheer up into the air. She carried him, clasped in her arms, a weird, struggling object, to the clumsy boat that lay always at the top of the beach. She dropped him into the bottom, took her seat, and unshipped the oars. For one moment the coast guardsman hesitated. Then he obeyed her look. He gave the boat a push which sent it grinding down the pebbles into the sea. The woman began to work at the oars. Every now and then she looked over her shoulder at the thin line of white surf which they were all the time approaching. "What are you doing, woman?" Mr. Fentolin demanded hoarsely. "Listen. It was an accident that your people were drowned. I'll give you an annuity. I'll make you rich for life. Rich. Do you understand what that means?" "Aye," she answered, looking down upon him as he lay doubled up at the bottom of the boat. "I know what it means to be rich, better than you, maybe. Not to let the gold and silver pieces fall through your fingers, or to live in a great house and be waited upon by servants who desert you in the hour of need. That isn't being rich. It's rich to feel the touch of the one you love, to see the faces around of those you've given birth to move on through the days and nights towards the end with them around, not to know the chill loneliness of an empty life. I'm a poor woman, Mr. Fentolin, and it's your hand that made me so, and not all the miracles that the Bible ever told can make me rich again." "You are a fool," he shrieked. "You can buy forgetfulness. The memory of everything passes." "I may be a fool," she retorted grimly, "and you the wise man, but this day we'll both know the truth." There was a little murmur from the shore, where the fishermen stood in a long line. "Bring him back, missus," Jacob called out. "You've scared him enough. Bring him back. We'll leave him to the law." They were close to the line of surf now. They had passed it, indeed, a little on the left. The boat was drifting. She stood up straight and stern, and her face, as she looked towards the land, was lit with the fire of the prophetess. "Aye," she cried, "we'll leave him to the law of God." Then they saw her stoop down, and once more, with that almost superhuman strength which seemed to belong to her for those few moments, she lifted the strange object who lay cowering there, high above her head. From the shore they realized what was going to happen, and a great shout arose. She stood on the side of the boat and jumped, holding her burden tightly in her arms. So they went down and disappeared. Half a dozen of the younger fishermen were in the water even before the grim spectacle was ended. Another ran for a boat that was moored a little way down the beach. But from the first the search was useless. Only Jacob, who was a person afflicted with many superstitions, wiped the sweat from his forehead as he leaned over the bow of his boat and looked down into that fathomless space. "I heard her singing, her or her wraith," he swore afterwards. "I'll never forget the moment. I looked down and down, and the water seemed to grow clearer. I saw her walking there at the bottom among the rocks, with him over her back, singing as she went, looking everywhere for George and the boys." But if indeed his eyes were touched with fire at that moment, no one else in the world saw anything more of Miles Fentolin. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Vanished Messenger by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. John P. Dunster removed the cigar from his teeth and gazed at the long white ash with the air of a connoisseur. He was stretched in a long chair high up in the terraced gardens behind the hall. At his feet were golden mats of yellow crocuses, long borders of hyacinths, pink and purple, beds of violets, a great lilac tree with patches of blossoms here and there forcing their way into a sunlit world. The sea was blue. The sheltered air where they sat was warm and perfumed. Mr. Dunster, who was occupying the position of a favored guest, was feeling very much at home. "There is one thing," he remarked meditatively, "which I can't help thinking about you Britishers. You may deserve it or you may not, but you do have the most almighty luck." "Sheer envy," Hamel murmured. "We escape from our tight corners by forethought." "Not on your life, sir," Mr. Dunster declared vigorously. "A year or less ago you got a North Sea scare, and on the strength of a merely honorable understanding with your neighbor, you risk your country's very existence for the sake of adding half a dozen battleships to your North Sea squadron. The day the last of those battleships passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, this little conference was plotted. I tell you, they meant to make history there. There was enough for everybody. India for Russia, time-honored dream, but why not? Alsace-Lorraine and perhaps Egypt for France. Australia for Japan, China and South Africa for Germany. Why not? You may laugh at it on paper, but I say again, why not?" "It didn't quite come off, sir," Gerald observed. "It didn't," Mr. Dunster admitted, "partly owing to you. There were only two things needed: France to consider her own big interests, and to ignore an entente from which she gains nothing that was not assured to her under the new agreement, and the money. Strange," Mr. Dunster continued, "how people forget that factor, and yet the man who was responsible for the Hague Conference knew it. We in the States are right outside all these little jealousies and wrangles that bring Europe every now and then right up to the gates of war. But I'm hanged if there is one of you dare pass through those gates without a hand on our money markets." "It's a new world in history, that little document, news of which Mr. Gerald here took to The Hague. The word of the money kings of the world. There is something that almost nips your breath in the idea that a dozen men, descended from Lord knows whom, stopped a war which would have altered the whole face of history." "There was never any proof," Hamel remarked, "that France would not have remained staunch to us." "Very likely not," Mr. Dunster agreed, "but on the other hand, your country had never the right to put such a burden upon her honor. Remember that side by side with those other considerations, a great statesman's first duty is to the people over whom he watches, not to study the interests of other lands. However, it's finished. The Hague Conference is broken up. The official organs of the world allude to it, if at all, as an unimportant gathering called together to discuss certain frontier questions with which England had nothing to do. But the memory of it will live. A good cold douche for you people, I should say, and I hope you'll take warning by it. Whatever the attitude of America as a nation may be to these matters, the American people don't want to see the old country in trouble. Gee whiz, what's that?" There was a little cry from all of them. Only Hamel stood without a sign of surprise, gazing downward with a grim, set face. A dull roar, like the booming of a gun, flashes of fire, and a column of smoke. All that was left of St. David's Tower was one tottering wall and a scattered mass of masonry. "I had an idea," Hamel said quietly, "that St. David's Tower was going to spoil the landscape for a good many years. My property, you know, and there's the end of it. I am sick of seeing people for the last few days come down and take photographs of it for every little rag that goes to press." Mr. Dunster pointed out to the line of surf beyond. "If only some hand," he remarked, "could plant dynamite below that streak of white, so that the sea could disgorge its dead. They tell me there's a Spanish galleon there, and a Dutch warship, besides a score or more of fishing boats." Mrs. Fentolin shivered a little. She drew her cloak around her. Gerald, who had been watching her, sprang to his feet. "Come," he exclaimed. "We chose the gardens for our last afternoon here to be out of the way of these places. We'll go round the hill." Mrs. Fentolin shook her head once more. Her face had recovered its serenity. She looked downward gravely, but with no sign of fear. "There is nothing to terrify us there, Gerald," she declared. "The sea has gathered, and the sea will hold its own." Hamel held out his hand to Esther. "I have destroyed the only house in the world which I possess," he said. "Come and look for violets with me in the spinney, and let us talk of the houses we are going to build and the dreams we shall dream in them." End of chapter 36. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Vanished Messenger by Phillips OPPENHEIM.